Thank you very much, Ina, for this kind introduction, and thank you to the School of Civic Education for inviting me to speak here. It's my big pleasure, and I'm also looking forward to have an interactive discussion later on after my introductory remarks, which will primarily deal with the current situation, but also with the question in the long run, what kind of vision do we actually pursue in this situation as a community, and particularly as a world community, as democrats, freedom fighters if you wish, but also as global citizens. And the predicament we are under, of course, is a very difficult one. It is dark times, in particular at this moment, because of the Russian aggression, but also because of rising geopolitical conflicts all over the world that involve China and other players, in particular the United States. With the, with Trump's second administration, matters have not become easier. And this also impacts, for instance, on the United Nations, which is the best effort, despite all limitations, of humanity thus far to achieve global collaboration. And you might know that the US administration plans to cut down its contributions to the UN almost completely, which means that 20% of UN funding is missing. China is holding back its contributions across the system tactically, which in effect means, and this is just one element of this crisis, of the global crisis we are in, of course, which means that Guterres warned that within 6 months the UN might be bankrupt, insolvent, right? Except if drastic cuts are made and if the financial regulations of the UN are changed so they can work with a tentative budget. And this is really reflecting also more largely on the international community that I would like to say is not covering the gap. I don't see any appetite on the part of member states to go in there, and we can discuss why is this the case. Why has hope in the UN been going down, except it's the only organization we have with a universal approach and aspiration and almost universal membership. And this is in a situation where we got these conflicts, where at the same time we are living in a planetary civilization. This is quite obvious because there are shared challenges that affect every human being on the planet. That is obvious. I don't need to tell this to you in much detail. It is obvious in the field of climate change. The atmosphere is a global common good. Everybody who uses it, for instance, through emissions, impacts everybody else on the planet, and this is visible through global warming and its impacts all over the world. Different impacts for sure in different regions. The severity is very different. So we have these global common goods that are given by nature, like the atmosphere or the high oceans and other elements. But of course, we also have public goods that in a functional state are supposed to be provided to the people. And the people are supposed to be in charge of providing, managing this, and providing accountability over the government, electing the government, which brings us to the question of democracy. And these public goods themselves are transcending borders very often, which brings us, for instance, to the question of peace and security. Each country is supposed to provide peace and security to its people, as a principle, I would argue, but this is not possible, in a silo. I would argue that providing peace and security is really a global public good that has to be provided through international collaboration. And this brings us to the question, why is this not working? It is dysfunctional, obviously. It is dysfunctional because, and this is the thesis I would put in front of you, because the nation-state system based on the idea of exclusive sovereignty is dysfunctional per se. By definition, it is dysfunctional. It is anarchic. There are many layers of civilized collaboration on top of this anarchic system. But if we, go down to the root causes, it's still there, right? And we can see how fragile it is with the ascendance of Trump, who's been threatening Greenland and Panama. But of course, we can see it especially in countries that are under autocratic rule or even outright dictatorship. Governments that are not accountable to their own people, they are even less accountable to anyone else internationally. They cannot be trusted in following international rules and international law that has built up in centuries of time. They cannot be trusted to follow it except it serves their own interest. There is this theory of democratic peace, and I think there's a lot that is in it here. The theory of democratic peace, you are probably familiar with it, says that it is less likely, probably not completely unlikely, but it is less likely that democratic states would go to war with each other. And that is because the people are basically supposed to be in charge, and the government is accountable to its people. And we can see with these threats against Greenland, from the Trump administration and sanctioning, countries that, as democracy is backsliding in the US, we can see how this is getting, more traction again, even in conflicts, even conflicting with other democratic supposed partners, even within NATO. So the provision of public goods is not only about peace and security that is undermined by this anarchic system, but it is also visible in many other fields, certainly, like health. We have seen it during the COVID-19 pandemic, how health is really a global public good that has to be provided through international collaboration if it is to be effective. And I mentioned the climate crisis already. And the root cause, as I mentioned, is the idea of exclusive, absolute national sovereignty. And there are many countries still that are promoting this more than ever, actually. Non-interference in international affairs, and that is self-serving because they want to have a free hand, doing whatever they wish at home. And there is lots of backtracking in terms of international law principles that have been developed over time, like the responsibility to protect, where countries like especially Russia, China, and others are saying we need to go back to the time when there was no interference in international affairs. And we can see this reflected also going back to the UN and how in the UN80 process, certain countries like those I mentioned, they are trying especially to cut down funding of the UN human rights system, which has, the least funding anyway in the three pillars of the UN. The three pillars of the UN, which are peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. The human rights pillar only gets around 7% of the budget. And they want this to be, cut down much more than the other pillars. So we can see how this plays out in different ways in the international system. And the question, of course, arises, and we are not the first, certainly, to raise it, is how do we overcome the anarchic system of nation states that are competing with each other, and not only in terms of peace and security. And the thing is that if this is not fundamentally solved, the risk of war will always retain, because you can have backsliding in single countries. Aggressive nationalism can take over, which for certain, for various reasons then transforms into imperialist aggression to the outside. And my argument is that this kind of dynamics is always fragile. So we have to find ways, how can it be lifted to a new level of cooperation? And this brings us to the long-term vision that my organizations and many others are pursuing, which is a vision of world law, which means it's actually very simple, it's very straightforward, maybe too straightforward for many academics, but we argue that the principles and procedures and institutions and legal mechanisms that have developed at the nation-state level to assure peaceful collaboration of communities, those principles and mechanisms and institutions, they can be globalized, right? Which essentially means that we have to globalize democracy. But it also means, if we take it seriously, that we have to think about global citizenship, and we have to think about how do nation states integrate into a system, and how would they accept to abide by binding world law. And this is also simple in my mind, because we can see also how this has been done at the nation-state level in terms of federations, federated states. Federated states, and the European Union is a supranational experiment in this regard. Maybe it's more than an experiment by now. But you can see how in federated states you have different levels of government that have their own institutions, their own distributed competences that are governed by the principle of subsidiarity, which means that problems have to be dealt with at the lowest possible level, but still at a level where it is effective. And this brings us basically to the idea of world federalism and a global constitution that would govern how those different levels of government relate to each other. But the precondition is certainly a new understanding of sovereignty. A new understanding of sovereignty in the direction of that nation states would agree to share sovereignty. They wouldn't give it up so completely. They would have sovereignty on those issues that remain at their level. But in terms of providing global public goods and managing global common goods, there would have to be a global layer of government. A global layer of government, a world federation, that is, of course, based on established democratic principles that we know that have been tested nationally, which is, for instance, the rule of law, which is the guarantee of individual freedoms and rights, which is democratic institutions based on checks and balances, the three branches of government that have been established at the nation-state level, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. And my organization, in fact, is working on the idea that we have to now make first steps in developing the legislative element. And this is tackling directly the idea of intergovernmentalism that is connected with the idea of national sovereignty. And the paradigm here for centuries has been that there is this traditional separation between foreign policy and domestic policy, right? And in terms of that separation, the traditional idea, and I have implied it already, that many states still defend, the traditional idea is that the executive branch of the government is in charge of foreign affairs. The diplomats, the career diplomats, the bureaucrats in the ministries, they are dealing with foreign affairs, and everything else is domestic. And this is, of course, also in times of globalization, a way, I would argue, to avert democratic social deliberation. Because if you push things into the foreign affairs area, it kind of also excludes the society that is affected by more and more issues that are dealt with by international collaboration, which means overcoming intergovernmentalism to bring in other actors into the field of global decision-making and global deliberation, in particular at the UN, but not only at the UN, right? So it means that we have to, looking at it in small steps, we have to promote the idea that issues like climate change, climate policy, peace and security, disarmament, they cannot be discussed alone by diplomats and the highest level politicians. And this brings us then to the specific idea of a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. We also, nothing I'm saying has been invented by us. None of this is my own idea. All of this has been around for a long time, and we are just patching it together into a whole picture and trying to advocate these ideas. So a UN Parliamentary Assembly, this proposal has been around for a long time, and it has been promoted at first by Louis Sohn in 1948 when the Council of Europe was created, and with the Council of Europe a parliamentary assembly of the member states, right, which was composed of national parliamentarians from the then Council of Europe member states. And in fact, the idea of a global parliamentary body that brings together elected representatives, as opposed to career diplomats, right, predates the UN. It even predates the League of Nations, you know, the predecessor of the UN. It has first come up, in fact, during the French Revolution and put forward by Anacharsis Clotes, a Dutch Prussian revolutionary. Well, he was he was coming from a feudal family, but still a revolutionary who at the time argued the French Revolution, that was based on this idea of equality and freedom, should not only be a revolution that, you know, transforms France and the French people, but over time, as monarchies and feudal lords are toppled, even militarily, he argued at the time, those, you know, those areas that would come under French control, they would be added to this new universal republic as départements that would have their own elected representatives. But we know history turned out differently. He was beheaded and killed himself as a cosmopolitan traitor in the 1790s. But I'm just saying that we have this very long history we can draw on this experience of federal states, on the experience of democracy. And in terms of democracy, perhaps some more thought, because we can see how, especially in developed countries that have a longer history in democracy, there is a fatigue, a dramatic fatigue and a tragic fatigue. But I also think it has to do with the fact of this separation between foreign and domestic policy. People can see, obviously, that their own institutions at home are more and more losing influence on important matters, even including migration, climate change. They are just ineffective, because if you work on this in a silo, in a national silo, the leverage you have to manage this is small. And there is a sense amongst people, I think, that this is happening. So not only are we dealing with peace and security and the anarchic system itself, but we are also trying to heal, to complete democracy, to look at it as a coherent concept that goes across all the levels of government that are necessary, from the local to the global. So I would argue that democracy will continue to decline globally if it is not completed in a democratic world federation based on a global constitution, and that, provides a global citizenship layer to each and every individual person. So the UN Parliamentary Assembly, that is one of the practical programs we are working on. It's complex. I can talk more about it later on, perhaps. But the key to understand it really is to look at it as a process. Very small embryonic steps could be made now, and the idea is that over time we have to be patient. Over time, as the geopolitical shifts hopefully change in the world, over time it could develop into this world parliament I mentioned, right? That would be directly elected by the people of the world, and given power to legislate on genuinely global issues in a system of legislation. We have to be very careful, and we have to think about risks that are also involved in all of that. But still, the risk of maintaining the status quo, this fundamental root cause of the anarchic system, is much higher. Over time, and more competent people have written about it, over time the likelihood that we will in fact see nuclear war happening grows and grows as long as nuclear weapons exist. And nuclear weapons will only be eliminated, which is certainly a dream we share. They can only be eliminated if we achieve this new layer of global civilization, an institutionalized world federation that is based also on mutual trust. Trust through institutions, trust because your partners in this setup, they are accountable to the people at all levels, from the local to the global, in particular at the nation-state level. And the elimination of nuclear weapons is also, of course, connected to the elimination of conventional weapons. If we look at the scenario, just for the sake of argument, that we would get rid of nuclear weapons within the current system, it would make conventional armament much more important even than it is today, right? And that is why, even in the 60s already, the idea of complete and comprehensive disarmament was, pushed at the time by Kennedy, Khrushchev, and others through the UN, even that already then made it clear there has to be this parallel process of conventional disarmament and nuclear disarmament. And the key here is, however, to build the necessary institutions. Well, so I will come to a stop here, but perhaps I have to mention another element in this, which is very practical and important, because we might feel, well, this is all nice talking about a world constitution and global democracy when we compare this to the situation we find ourselves in. But I would argue one of the, intellectually and spiritually even, mentally, one element that I feel is missing in the democratic world or people who promote democracy and freedom. What is missing is a picture, a mental picture. What is it that we want to achieve, really? What is it in terms of the global future that we pursue? Why are we doing this, right? And I would be happy to hear your thoughts. I mean, what is this struggle about? Is it about maintaining national sovereignty? Is it about keeping the enemy away? Is it about defending national democracy and building it up? And I would say, yes, all of that is true. But maybe there's more. Maybe we have to have a global vision of global, communality, of being together and world peace, and have this vision and as a, mental encouragement, even and particular in this dark time, right? We have to have that. And I think it's missing. I don't hear anywhere in official politics any such vision, right? It's reaction. We are reacting to these issues. But nobody in the high politics has the courage to come up with a vision. And this has been the case in the past. And this is the thought I wanted to introduce in this, conclusion of my remarks. Particularly dissidents like Václav Havel, they have had such a vision when they were, fighting against suppression in their countries. Václav Havel, for instance, was a supporter of a UN Parliamentary Assembly. He devoted his speech at the Millennium Assembly of the UN to this idea of a world parliament. And I would say the movement in high politics for such a vision that can bring us together, even globally, will not come from the United States. It will probably not, I'm sorry to say, not come from Canada or Western Europe, who have this fatigue, you know, who are backsliding and are dealing with their own problems. I think it will come from people, you know, perhaps like you, those who are perhaps in exile, those who are fighting against suppression and aggressive nationalism in their own countries. It will come from those people who will topple the Communist Party of China and who will topple Putin's regime in Russia. And I hope if that ever happens, that these people, these movements, they will show the way towards a global democracy and a better future. And well, that is my final message for this conclusion. Thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to discussion.
Thank you so much.